How are we doing today, folks? It's Friday, so generally better than other days. Is that correct? Last 2 days have been actually exquisite for me. I mean, yesterday was National Cheeseburger Day. You all know how I feel about cheeseburgers. Yeah. So it was a good day yesterday. Today is International Talk Like a Pirate Day. Did everybody know that? Yeah, it's International Talk Like a Pirate Day. So for International Talk Like a Pirate Day, for my first two classes are both AIS classes. I did pirate or AIS to pirate translations. I actually have got somewhere AI auditing to pirate translations, but I cannot find the file anywhere, so I can't actually show you the file up here. But I wanted to share some of the translations because I did post it to Facebook a while back. So, all right. So Dr. Michael Barnes is "Oh Glorious Captain." All right. Auditing students, you're swabbies. Okay, you're swabbies. Tax students are landlubbers. Audit risk, a storm's a brewing. Materiality, a bottle of rum. Adverse opinion, that's walk the plank. All right. Disclaimer opinion is R. And the accounting faculty is Jolly Crew. And just to show how old this is, I have Dr. Alan Davis on here, which nobody knows who that is anymore because he is a former tax professor that retired in late 2020, the end of the semester 2020. He was my nemesis. He was basically my biggest adversary. So how did I term him? He's a bilge rat. All right. So yeah. I actually can't call any of the other faculty members bilge rats because I actually get along with him, but it was okay to call him that because he deserved it. Let's be honest. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, hopefully that got the need for pirate out. So we're going to talk a little bit about the exam at the end of the discussion. But my experience has been if I hand out the exams now and try to do the lecture later, everybody's going to ignore the lecture and be like, I can't believe I missed this question. We have plenty of time over the weekend to think about, oh, I can't believe I missed that question. But we'll go over the exam review. But I do want to talk about the professional judgment framework. This is one of those unfortunate sacrifices that I've had to make for this course. I used to spend 2 days just on this topic, and it is fascinating. There's a lot of things we can talk about. It's not directly relevant to auditing, though it is important for auditing. And when I say not directly relevant, we're going to be learning a lot more broad concepts. I do want to caution you that you have to be very careful about how you use this. One of the things that I thought about doing is I always have like a political issue that I frame this with, and been a very big firestorm of a political issue in the news recently. I deliberately avoided that because people have very, very passionate feelings about that, and my goal is not to offend anyone. I want everybody to get along, and we're all going to be learning about auditing here, so we all have something in common into context. But I did find a little bit of a less inflammatory political issue. Depending on your context, you may still get upset about this. And if that's the case, I'm sorry. It was not my intention to make anyone upset. Is anybody familiar with the fight that's going on with the federal governor, Lisa Cook? Has anybody read about that in the news media? So President Trump has declared that he wants to fire the governor, federal governor, Lisa Cook. Now, Lisa Cook is basically a government employee, but she's kind of independent. She has oversight over what the Fed does. And there's an argument about whether President Trump can actually has the ability to fire her. So there's been a lot of news about this. And what I wanted to do is I want to share 3 headlines. And the headlines come from these sources right here: Huffington Post, CNN, and The Blaze. Now, you probably all heard of CNN. Can I assume that's correct? If you like CNN, what's that? I'm going to like, come on, get out in the world, guys. But CNN is kind of a moderate news source, kind of falls right in the middle. You may argue they're a little bit left leaning, but they do tend to report mostly objectively. Huffington Post is started by Ariana Huffington several years ago, very left leaning, very, very liberal. Whereas The Blaze is Glenn Beck's publication. It's very far right wing. And so they tend to report things differently. Now, based on just that context alone, I'm going to give you some headlines, and I would like you to tell me, do you think it's Huffington Post, HuffPost? Do you think it's CNN, or do you think it's The Blaze, based on the context of the headline? All right. Trump's firing of Fed Lisa Cook tests Supreme Court's limit on presidential power. What do you think?
Yeah.
That's CNN. It's very, very objective and straightforward. Statement does not really have any bias. All right, here we go. Trump fires Biden Fed governor for possible criminal conduct, but Lisa Cook is desperate to cling to power. That's The Blaze, yes. Fed governor whom Trump wants gone says she has no intention of being bullied to resign. That's Huffington Post, yeah. Now, these are all kind of reporting on the same story, but they have dramatically different perspectives. I am not trying to encourage you to embrace one perspective or another. I'm going to assume that you do that differently. But one thing that's really important to note is that as auditors, we have an obligation not just to have our own personal perspective, but to be able to recognize other perspectives. That's a lesson it took me a long time to learn. And so objectivity is really, really important in our profession. And I would argue that it's not just true for auditing, but it's true for all accounting and business professions as well. An objective perspective is going to be very important. So we're going to talk a little bit today about why that's critical in this day and age, and particularly for our profession. One thing that I think is really, really problematic is the idea of social media usage in today's day and age. Now, I probably use social media more than I should. I don't have Instagram. I don't have Twitter. I spend probably more time on Facebook than the average person, but I do kind of limit what I expose myself to. One of the issues with social media is that social media tends to congregate like-minded personalities. And so if you have a perspective, it's very easy for the algorithm to match you to other people with that perspective. And that creates something called an echo chamber, or probably more importantly, mob mentality. Have you heard that term mob mentality before? Individually, I think any of us could have an extreme opinion, and we could recognize that that extreme opinion is false. Okay, we can recognize, all right, that's ridiculous. I can't believe that thought popped into my head. You have that reinforced by a few dozen people around you that are all thinking the same thing, and all of a sudden that becomes far less of an extreme point of view. And it's like, well, this is mainstream because everybody around me agrees with me. That's one of the problems of social media and why exposure to social media can be problematic. Now, I'm not trying to dig on social media. It is an effective means for communication and makes us more connected. There are definitely some positives to it, but you do have to be very careful because there are some drastic negatives, some very, very big downsides to it. And there's also the issue of the fact that what we learn in college tends to be very, very focused on intelligence. And there's a big difference between intelligence and common sense. You probably heard the term book smarts and street smarts. Those are meant to be different concepts because you can have somebody who's very, very knowledgeable, but doesn't apply that knowledge very effectively. All right. So the good example of this, one of my roommates back in college was very, very bright, but he didn't have much of a family life growing up. His birth father left when he was early, and his stepfather was fairly abusive, and he ended up leaving home when he was like 13 years old. So he didn't really have anybody who was teaching him about how to make better decisions with his life. And so he just made he was very, very smart, very, very talented, very good looking, all the things I wish I was. And, but he was just, he made some just boneheaded decisions with his life, just things that a practical decision maker wouldn't be able to know. And that was entirely kind of his climate and his environment. He became better as we spent time more around each other. But there were some times where I was just kind of like, I just want to slap you really, really bad because some of the things that he'd say and do were just really problematic. Keep in mind that one of the things that I do focus on in this course and all my courses is that there's a conceptual difference between memorization and learning. Remember the assertions that I said you have to know the assertions? Does that mean that you have to memorize the assertions? Yes, but it goes beyond that. It goes well beyond that. And your goal here as a college student is to learn, not to memorize. And now, just for context, if you come back to college and if you're recruiting 5 years from now and I see you at Meet the Firms, I'm not going to immediately say, quick, what are the 5 components of the COSO framework? Okay. I mean, I might, but if you don't answer, that's okay. All right. But I may ask you, what have you learned as part of your experience? And you should be able to explain how what you've learned is relevant to your education that you received here at Truman. It's all about application of this information. And learning, as by definition, generally involves critical thinking, which critical thinking is very important to our profession because we have to utilize it for professional judgment purposes. So problem solving, critical thinking, that is basically the crux of it. That's why auditing can be such a difficult discipline because there are no right answers in some situations. There's just a best answer. All right, so quick question for y'all. Is there a difference between making a decision and making a judgment? What do you think? Probably so, but how do we frame that difference? How do we actually illustrate the difference in it? So let's say that I am really happy with you all on the exams and your performance, which by the way, I am. I was really happy with the performance on the exam. So I decide I'm going to take you all out for a meal on me. I'm not going to do that, sadly, but let's just use this as a context. And so I say, let's go ahead and let's just make a decision, or let's just try to decide what we're going to do. And I say, what do you want to eat? Half the class is like, we're going to Maxwell's, Dr. Barnes, because they've got a wide array of stuff. Half the group's like, Taco Bell, Dr. Barnes, they're the best. And I get a little bit sick in my stomach for that half of the class, but it's split right down the middle, which is difficult since there's 15 people, but it's split right down the middle. So What are my options in that situation? Well, I can make a judge, or I can make a decision, and that would be as easy as flipping a coin, and whichever comes up, we make that decision. So if it comes up heads, it's Maxwell's, and I'm like, yes, blue, or Baltimore Blue Burger. And if it comes down tails, it's like, ugh, I'm not eating, Taco Bell. Yeah, that would be making a decision. But is that making a judgment? Not really. I've not used any of the factors inherent to actually try to drive towards what the decision point is. So making a judgment involves a lot more critical analysis of detail and thinking about some of the things that are relevant to the choice. So keep in mind that we can actually make a decision without making a judgment. We can't really make a judgment without the decision point, but judgment involves a lot more necessarily. So with respect to the professional judgment framework, by the way, this is in the book. It's on pages 741 to 749 for your research. There will be an exam question. It's only a single multiple choice question. That being said, I think this is probably one of the more practical things that you'll learn in this course because it will be applicable to all sorts of disciplines if you want to review this. It actually talks about this as a professional judgment framework. This is from KPMG's judgment monograph that they created, I think it was a couple decades ago. And it kind of clarifies how you are going to approach making a judgment in this day and age. Now, you do not need to worry too much about understanding these steps. I'm not going to test you on these steps. I will tell you straight up, I'm not going to test you on this diagram right here. The reason I bring this diagram up is if this is something that's so intuitive, it's relatively intuitive, why do we need a diagram to show us how to make a judgment? And the answer is that we as human beings have become very, very acquainted with making decisions absent of judgment. And so making judgment is not something that's just necessarily second nature to us. Think about this. Have you made decisions today without using judgment? What is the very first thing you did when you woke up to hit the snooze alarm, Dr. Barnes? Okay, after that, when you actually decided to get out of bed, did you lie in bed for a few seconds saying, all right, what are the benefits of getting up on the right side of the bed versus getting up on the left side of the bed? If I get up on the right side, it's a little bit warmer, but my slippers are on the left-hand side, so my feet will be warm if I put up. Did anybody actually go through that decision process? No, you probably didn't make the judgment. You're just like, I got up on this side of the bed every single day for the last 10 weeks, and I'm going to continue doing the other side. It's a snap call. We operate very heavily as human beings via something called heuristics, mental shortcuts. And a lot of the things that we do, we necessarily have to operate like that because we can't really assign mental bandwidth to every single decision we have to make. So once we've done something, we tend to be repetitive in that nature. And this is very, very common for us. I noticed that every single person in the room sat in the seat that they've been sitting the entire semester. And that's kind of common. That's actually something I rely on in seating charts. Even though I say you don't have to sit in the same spot, you all don't randomize on me, which is great, okay? Because then I get to learn faces and names and it makes me sad. Now, even at the audit level, I think if you all start randomizing just to mess with me, I think I'd be okay in this group because it's a small class and I've had you all before and I know everybody's names. If my AS class did it, I'd be in trouble, okay? I'd just be kind of like, okay, I don't know who anybody is anymore. So yeah, the heuristics can be actually used to advantage, but it's not very good for judgments. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about a couple of high-level concepts. The first of these concepts is going to be about how do we maintain objectivity. All right, so objectivity is one of those things that becomes increasingly abandoned in this day and age because people tend to have very strong perspectives and point of view. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have a point of view. I'm not saying that if you have a very, very strong opinion about a particular topic that you should abandon that opinion. The point is that when you make a critical judgment, that cannot affect that your perspective cannot affect that judgment. You need to be objective. So there's actually this concept called dosoi logoi. Has anybody ever heard of dosoi logoi? Okay, so this is a rhetorical exercise that was developed in ancient Greece. The idea behind this exercise is that you would debate a perspective, and then you would take the opposite end of that perspective and you would debate that one. So example would be cheeseburgers are good. Okay, I personally believe that. Okay, why are cheeseburgers good? I could go into a lot of detail about why cheeseburgers are just great and fantastic, and then I'm supposed to argue why cheeseburgers bad. Okay, well they can carry considerable health risks. Breeding cattle is not good for the environment. There are definitely more friendly options with respect to animal welfare. I have considered all of those options, okay, which makes me seem like a little bit of a monster now that I say I want cheeseburgers, okay. That being said, I am cognizant of what their perspectives are, the different perspectives I can carry in that. This is the idea of dosoi logoi. Has anybody ever heard of the video game series Civilization? Okay, so I'm a big fanatic of Civilization. I played all 7 versions of Civilization, many hours. They just got Civilization 7 this past year. I think it was in February of this past year. And I was looking at my hours on Civilization 6. It is an obscene amount. Okay. Let's just say if I worked that many hours in a single year, that people would say, oh, you must have put in a ridiculous amount of overtime. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Civilization. One of the things that when you unlock education, when you unlock any technology in Civilization, they give you a quote. So one of the quotes that they use for education is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. That's an Aristotle quote, which I think is very profound and very important. It's that you guys should be able to understand and accept things, or understand and acknowledge things without necessarily having to accept them. And this is something that, again, true for real life, but very important for our profession. We're going to talk a little bit about biases that kind of influence this, but this is what we should ultimately be going for in every scenario, optimally. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about judgment traps. So there's an example in the book, so I'm not going to go in there just yet, talking about judgment traps. And this is about halfway through the chapter, talks about some things that create problems for judgment, traps to judgment. So there are 2 of these that they identify, and both of these are very important. First one is going to be called the rush to solve. We have a problem, we have an issue, and there's a certain deadline on solving this issue. So we take shortcuts in our approach to make judgments on that. Then we like to think that we don't actually do that, but you all are Truman students. You have many deadlines that you're going to face throughout the course of your career. Would you say that you probably made a judgment that was an error just based on the deadline? I'm going to say most of you did this relatively recently, okay? You were stuck with a 50-minute deadline to complete an exam, and you thought, all right, I'm going to answer this question, and I may have made a mistake. And that's fine. We do put that necessary pressure on you, but it's a really challenging one to address. If I gave everybody a lot more time, if I gave you a lot more resources, I think the exam scores would have been even higher. But that's okay. Okay, that's one of the tests. Now, in the real world, we'd like to avoid that. An interesting example of this, has anybody ever heard of the gentleman named Richard Jewell? So there was a movie made about him several years ago, a Clint Eastwood movie. So Richard Jewell was a security guard at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics. And if you know anything about the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, there was a bomb that went off at the Olympics. Richard Jewell was originally recognized as the individual who saved a whole lot of people from being injured in that bomb. He saved over 100 people in that injury. So then they started trying to figure out who was the one who set off the bomb. And you know who the first suspect was? Richard Jewell, all right? And he got a lot of hatred for this. And if you know anything about Richard Jewell, the actor who played him in the movie is Paul Walter Hauser, who's the guy who plays Stingray in Cobra Kai. You know, kind of dumpy fellow, overweight, balding, just kind of what you would think and he's a country boy, so you just kind of think that he's just kind of a loser. That's the perspective they put on him. And so they took this narrative and they ran with it. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution said, we want to break this case before the Olympics end. And the FBI was also on it, said, okay, but once the Olympics end, we don't have a chance to investigation. So they were under a really quick time frame. And they basically said, Richard Jewell is our main suspect. And so he got a lot of hate, a lot of anger, and a lot of vitriol directed to him. And they basically said he was guilty. And turns out he was not. He was absolutely a hero. He saved a whole bunch of people's lives by doing his job, and he didn't really want anything other than to be acknowledged as having done his job. They found out who the bomber was, and it was well after the Olympics were over. But he had basically had to live for 3 months in his house, his apartment, and could not leave. He was just kind of anytime he went out, the media just swarmed him, or people said hateful things to them. That is the danger. That is an extreme case, but that is the danger of having the rush to solve, is that you can make very poor judgments, and they have big consequences. Now, unfortunately, Richard Jewell passed away in the mid-2000s, and so he never got the acknowledgement that he deserved. He basically should have been acknowledged as a hero and should have been throwing, they say, in 30 for 30, should have been throwing out first pitches at baseball games for saving so many people's lives. If anybody else in that scenario was that, they'd be acclaimed as a hero forever. And now we just kind of look back at some of the bad decisions we make as a result of that. Another judgment trap that they talk about in the book is solving the wrong problem. Now, I've always struggled to approach this, so I decided to use the example from the book to explain. So they talk about 2 fictitious snack companies, Axe Snacks and Bob's Goodies. And basically, Bob's Goodies is losing market share, and they can't figure out why. And they look at Axe Snacks and they say, wow, they've got really, really flashy packaging. We should emulate that. That would increase our market share. So they try to do that and they fail. There doesn't improve their market share. So they made a snap judgment and they basically said, we think that this is the reason. And they didn't really provide any context for why that was the reason. They solved the wrong problem, because what the problem they talked about in the book is that Axe Snacks tended to focus on smaller package sizes, like 1 ounce packages, as opposed to big boxes of chips. And that's what people were really looking for in their snacking appetites. So they solved that problem after some market research, but they spend a lot of money on a problem that didn't really exist. That's kind of the goal of when you're trying to answer solving the wrong problems. You're trying to avoid something called judgment triggers. We identify a problem and then we say, I think I know the cause of the problem. Thinking you know the cause of the problem and knowing the cause of the problem are two different things. So even though you may have a good inclination, it still requires dedication and research to understand the source of an issue. Now, how do we maintain objectivity, and how do we avoid solving the wrong problem? And the book talks about something called judgment framing as being the key to this. Now, judgment framing is a really challenging concept. The idea being is that we should be able to have a different perspective from our own to actually look at an issue. Easy one is talks about the parable of the six blind men. Elephant and the six blind men. Has anybody heard about this? So there's an old story, and there's actually a YouTube video that I've linked in the slides if you want to watch it. It's going to be much better narrative than mine. But the parable goes, there are six blind men walking down a road, and they all encounter an elephant. So they're all trying to discern the nature of the elephant. And you can see one of them is grabbing the trunk, another one's grabbing the tusk, another one's grabbing the ear. So the one that grabs the trunk says the elephant is like a snake. Another one says, no. And grabbing the tusk said the elephant is like a pipe. The one that grabs the ear says elephant is like a fan. All right. So they're all arguing about the nature of the elephant. And then somebody walks down the road and says, why are you arguing? He says, we're trying to actually determine the nature of the elephant. And we all have a disagreement. So, well, you're all right. You just have an incomplete view of the picture. You have an incomplete view of the whole issue. So the way the book actually talks about it is it talks about making sure that when you address an issue, that you address it not just from your perspective, but from other perspectives as well. It uses the term called a fresh lens, L-E-N-S, like something you look through, trying to look at an unfettered view of the world. Now, the best way I can think about to frame this is something that frankly, it's going to be a food issue, but it's something that I'm a little bit antsy about. Has anybody ever had sushi before? So there's sushi places in Kirksville are okay. I do miss some of the places that are on the coast. I do think that there's a little bit higher quality, but for the most part, sushi is okay here. When you get sushi, usually they serve this nasty pink stuff on the side that they encourage you to have in between pieces of sushi. What is that stuff called? Pickled ginger, yeah, pickled ginger, which is disgusting, and I would never put it in my mouth or even touch it, okay? I tried it one time and I was like, okay, somebody has done something to try to sabotage me. But so I hate pickled ginger, obviously, but what is the purpose of the pickled ginger on there? Yeah, it's a palate cleanser, okay? Certain pieces of sushi have very, very strong flavors to them, like a piece of tuna, like a tuna sashimi or tuna sushi. Very, very heavy on the flavor and very heavy on the smell. So if you try to eat another piece of sushi after you have a piece of tuna sushi, it's probably still going to taste like tuna, which kind of ruins the experience if you're having different experiences. So they say, we're going to let you put this disgusting piece of pink stuff in your mouth, and that will actually clear out the flavor of tuna, which I'm like, thanks, but no thanks. All right. Intuitively, it actually makes sense. It's just I just don't like pickled ginger. Okay. But the palate cleanser does serve a purpose. The idea is that we want to enjoy everything from its own perspective. So everything has a different perspective, and we need to be able to acknowledge those perspectives. All right, let's talk about mental shortcuts. Now, I'm going to tell you straightforward and straight up, 90% chance that a question that I'm going to ask on the exam will come from these 4 mental shortcuts, okay? So make sure you understand these shortcuts. I would definitely refer back to the book. These are going to sound very familiar. I will use the word tendency to describe these, but for the most part, you can use the term interchangeably, use the term bias, okay? So what are these 4 tendencies? The first of these is called something you've probably heard of, is availability tendency. And that is that we tend to make judgments based on only readily available information. So an example would be is that you're working, you're doing something online and you're working and somebody says, hey, did you hear about this? And you say, oh yeah, I did a research paper about this back a few years ago. You pull all your sources from your research paper that are a few years old and you say, all right, this is the answer to this issue. Is that necessarily the best approach? No, you're limiting your scope to what the readily available information is. Is it possible that things have changed over the time frame that you've not looked at? Yes. Can that be problematic in an audit? Like if I say, all right, I've got a lot of information from last year and I can make a really good judgment based on last year's working papers. We're not worried about what happened last year. We're worried about what happened in this year. So we want to dig a little bit deeper than just what is readily available to us. Particularly if we think it's a problem, we don't necessarily just want to let it go. We need to necessarily go through the steps, making sure that we are rigorous in our approach. Something you're probably familiar with, the second tendency is called the confirmation tendency. Now, this is probably the one that you're most familiar with because this is the one that's talked about all the time over social media, and that's the tendency to make judgments based on our own existing biases. So say you have a belief that something really extreme. There are probably a lot of extreme beliefs, but you have an extreme belief, okay? And you're just like, okay, I believe this with all my heart and soul. And somebody says, well, here's a study that says that what you believe is completely wrong. It says, well, that's just one study. All right, here's 10 more studies that actually tell you what you believe is completely wrong. It says, that's not enough. I need more information. It says, okay, literally every single study except for one tells you that what you believe is wrong. Oh, can I see that study that tells me it's wrong? Okay, this study tells me I'm right. It says, okay, there's a prevailing mountain of evidence that tells you that you're wrong, but because you only want to hold on to information that supports your perspective, that's right. So is that a problem in an audit? Yeah, certainly. If you say, all right, I really don't want to do extra work this weekend. I really would like to take the weekend off because I've been working 80-hour weeks up until this point, and I really would just like to have some relaxation. And I'm gonna look at these receivables and oh my gosh, this receivable is out of balance. Or is it? Okay. You really, really don't want to believe it's out of balance. So you may actually have a confirmation bias there. It says, okay, if I look at it from this perspective, that the receivable is still just a timing difference, then maybe it's not out of balance. It's just we're a little bit behind on receiving the money. Yeah, that could be an example of a situation where you might do something that's a strong bias that could be up in a real problem. Confirmation bias is one that you have to be very, very cognizant and aware to avoid. All right, overconfidence tendency. The overconfidence tendency is basically putting too much of a belief in a set of skills. So I'm going to do a rude one and then I'm going to do something that's a little bit more practical. Okay. So I want you to think to yourself, do you think that with respect to this class that you're above average? Okay. Don't answer. Just think about it. Okay. Because I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, but think about it. Think about your above average. Now, if you answered yes, there's a 50% chance that you're wrong. Statistically speaking, 50% of you are below average. Kind of sobering, isn't it? Kind of sobering, isn't it? Now, the good news is if I expand the sample and say, do I think you're above average to everybody outside of this classroom? Most everybody in this classroom is going to be well above average with respect to auditing knowledge compared to the Truman State campus. And even that is a pretty high bar because Truman State students are generally very, very smart. Okay. So that's something to consider. And we tend to hold our own abilities in high regard, and necessarily so. But let's think about this. Do we know everything that we think that we know? There's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Has anybody ever heard of that? Dunning-Kruger effect is attributing our own skills based on social skills. So easy example of this. If I say, do you know how a toilet works? I said, well, yes, Dr. Barnes, obviously. I said, okay, explain it to me. And then you'll be like, I've never really thought too much about pushing the lever. Okay. Here's another one. Do you know how a zipper works? I'm like, yes, I use one every day when I get dressed. Okay, explain the mechanism to me. Pretty sobering, huh? Pretty sobering, yeah. We attribute societal knowledge, what we know as a society, to our own existence, which is certainly problematic. So overconfidence is really in our nature. It's just really, really kind of in our roots. That's something that we have to be very cognizant of. The final tendency is something called the anchoring tendency. Now, as you're making notes on this, I would like you to make sure that you make a quick note because this is always confusing. Quantitative anchor. All right, quantitative anchor. That's one of the important points to remember when we talk about anchoring tendency. It's very similar to the availability tendency, but usually this starts with setting a quantitative anchor, some sort of number, and then failing to move far enough away from it. All right. So let's think about this, okay? I think I've told you how old I am, but let's assume that you have this belief in your mind, this anchor, and you think Dr. Barnes is going to be about 40 years old. And then you hear my true age, which is a lot older than 40, okay? And you're just like in disbelief. That can't possibly be right. He could not possibly have be that old, okay? Mostly because I act like an immature fool sometimes, okay? Yeah, I'm a goofball, but I can't possibly be that old. Let's say that turns out that, or on the other hand, let's say it turns out you have this anchor, believe I'm 40, 40 is about right, and I tell you I'm in my 20s, I just lived a rough life, okay? You're going to be equally dubious of that, okay? That's because you have this preset notion that you did not move far enough away from. It's really, really hard to move against preset conceptions. Now, is this an auditing problem? Certainly, it could be an auditing problem. I kind of skipped the auditing problem for overconfidence tendency, so let's talk about that. So let's say your senior says, you're a Truman State graduate. You probably know a whole lot about auditing. I'm going to assign you to a task that's going to be more advanced. And you're going to be like, all right, well, apparently he has enough confidence in me to do it. I should be able to do it. And you fail to ask questions when you have issues. You fail to follow up. You fail to do the job as effectively as you need to, because even though they have confidence in your ability, you are not necessarily skilled enough to do it without help. Okay. That's certainly a problem. Now, as far as the anchoring tendency, let's say you go to the CEO and you say, all right, how much should the account balance in this account be? And the CEO gives you a balance that's really, really bad. Okay. Way too low. But you use that as your anchor. And then you go and you test the balance, and it turns out that balance is way, way off. So the numbers far different from what the CEO tells you. You're going to look at that and say, okay, this account's got to be misstated because the CEO believed it was a certain amount. Is that necessarily true? No, it just means that you've actually got a pre-existing belief of what the value should be, and you're not able to move far enough away from that. So an easy example of this is a kind of so this is the Garden of Eden, okay? It's a serpent in the Garden of Eden saying, Eve, you should eat the apple. It says, I'm not supposed to. It says, fine, you shouldn't want to do it. It costs $400. It says, okay, that's way too much money. And then the serpent says, wait a minute, it's only $4. And then Eve is like, okay, my apple's value is anchored to the high number you stated initially. Now I think it's a bargain, right? And then a little bit earlier, it's you see God's talking to the serpent. He's saying, "Are you reading the Necronomicon again?" It's no, he's reading behavioral economics. It says Economicon's kid stuff. Yeah, that's kind of the way to think about anchoring tendency, is that if people believe a certain value, that they're going to have interpretations of values that are different from those that are going to be consistent with that value expectation. All right. So here are the judgment tendencies listed. So I want to talk very briefly, we're running out of time, but I want to talk very briefly about the characteristics of skepticism when you approach this. So keep in mind a cornerstone of our profession is going to be the idea of professional skepticism. But what does that really mean? It means that you do need to question everything that's put forth to you. Even if it makes sense, you do need to have some sort of corroboration of that information. You also need to suspend judgment, particularly if you think that you're going to be subject to biases that might affect your judgment, and perform a very, very strong search for knowledge. So even if you believe you have the right answer, you still need to have support for that. Interpersonal understanding is really important because it's important to know that people have perspectives that are different from your own. Autonomy is really, really critical. So you do need to be able to operate independently. That does not mean that you can't ask for information or help when you need it, but you should have enough confidence that you can complete a task. And self-esteem just is going to be the confidence that you have in yourself to be able to complete that task as a whole. So like I said, I think that this is something that you can use outside of the classroom, and hopefully you find this useful, but it is something that you do need to actually have with respect to the discipline that you choose, and it's going to be very relevant to your path in your careers moving forward. All right, so as Rene Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. So we're going to go ahead and close it out with that, and we're going to talk about the exams.